Good evening, and thank you for joining the Facebook video class from Lindsley Avenue Church of Christ. We're continuing our study of why I believe, and this will be part 2 of the biological evolution discussion that we started last week. Hope you find some material here that will be of help and interest. We have this statement that will sometimes be made by those who are believers in evolution, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. By comparing similarities of proteins common to many living things, such as chitochrome C, we can adjust classification on the basis of biochemical similarities. Instead of putting necessarily bats and fox and a chimpanzee over in this grouping, you can compare them biochemically, looking at molecules, long chains of proteins, and the way that different changes line up, and group them based on similarities at the biochemical level. By doing so, a pattern of relationships is seen at the molecular level that is roughly consistent with relationships determined by visible features. Roughly is a key word for that. That's why you hear sometimes that humanity, man, woman, shares a rather large percentage of our genes with a chimpanzee and some of the great apes. To a Darwinist, this is evolution, because to Darwinists, relationship means evolutionary relationship. And this carries with it all the necessary creative powers attributed to natural selection to make it possible for simple ancestors to change into complex descendants. There's no other alternative. God is off the table. Therefore, this has to be the explanation. As a consequence of this logic, Darwinists consider it fairly perverse that anyone familiar with the molecular evidence would doubt evolution, this gradual naturalistic development of life by descent with modification. They just consider it perverse. Maybe that's where you're insane or wicked part comes in from the quote from Richard Dawkins that we talked about last week. However, I want to point out that a British biologist back in 1960 published a book called Implications of Evolution, and he took a good bit of heat for this, but he pointed out that there were 7 assumptions, unproven assumptions, involved in believing in evolution. The person who believes in evolution has to accept that these things did occur with no actual evidence for them. For example, life arose from non-living matter. We used to call that spontaneous generation, and I can remember studying about Louis Pasteur, who ended up showing that you had to have the crimp in the bottle for flies to get into the meat so that maggots were not just spontaneously generating. Well, life comes from life. So how did it happen this first time? Whatever life is supposed to have been, it came from non-life. And of course, there's no proof for that other than life is here. And from an evolutionary perspective, it had to not be here at some point. By logical deduction, you can believe that that occurred, but it is an assumption because it is not based on any demonstrable proof or replicated experiment. Also, spontaneous generation only occurred once. Remember that high school experiment where you had the meat that was separated from the fly who couldn't get in to lay eggs in the meat. Otherwise, well, look at this. There's something alive over in the corner. Well, maybe that's spontaneously generated overnight. We don't believe that. We don't teach that. We teach from a scientific perspective, it is taught from an evolutionary perspective that it happened only once. Well, that is nice and convenient for us. But if it happened more than once, then you're going to have all sorts of additional complications. So assumption of evolution is that it did happen and it happened only once. Somehow or other, viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. Remember that tree of life we looked at last week, and we didn't even have viruses on there specifically. That if life arose once, everything has to have descended from whatever that original life form looked like. They all have to be interrelated. If they're not interrelated, then you're violating assumption number 2. You were suggesting that spontaneous generation happened more than once. So number 3 is a consequence of accepting assumption number 2. Number 4, multicellular animals, metazoa, evolved from unicellular or single-celled organisms, protozoa or protists. You probably have seen maybe, again in high school under a microscope, an amoeba, paramecium. things that are unicellular. And then I remember looking at the hydra, one of the rather simple, rather being the key word, multicellular animals at the microscopic level. Somehow or other, you went from one cell to multiple celled animals. How did that change occur to where cells gave up independence, so to speak, and started working together? Number 5, the various invertebrate phyla are interrelated. Again, everything has to be interrelated. When you think of the different phyla, you've got the higher levels, kingdom, domain kingdom, and then you get to phyla, broad body plans. And so the vertebrates all have some kind of a backbone. And so fish and mammals, things like that, all have a backbone. And so they would fall into that one phyla. But there's a huge number of phyla that are all invertebrates, no backbones. And somehow or other, again, going down this list, they also have to be interrelated with some sort of common ancestor, and there's no good idea why at the moment. Number 6, vertebrates evolved from invertebrate animals. Well, the vertebrate phyla had to come from an initial single-celled animal, so yes, somehow or other a backbone came into being, and that's why we have vertebrate animals in the vertebrate phyla. The vertebrate animals evolved from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds and mammals. Again, those all have to have occurred if fish were some of the first vertebrate animals. They all have to be interrelated, and there's no good explanation for how these things occurred, and in many cases, not even a good candidate for, yes, this is where it occurred, or this is the example of a fossil of where it occurred. So some mathematicians in the past tried to make calculations to see how much time would be needed, how many the mutations needed for Darwin's theory to occur back in Philadelphia in 1967. And the result was a confrontation between themselves and some of the leading Darwinists. And the report is fascinating because of the logic of the Darwinist response. D.S. Ulam, a very famous mathematician, argued it was highly improbable that the eye, just the eye, could have evolved by the accumulation of small mutations, because the number of mutations necessary would have had to have been so large, and the time available was not nearly long enough for them to appear. If it took, I just make up numbers, if it took 1 million mutations and each one took 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or 100,000 years, you don't have enough time for the eye to come about by these gradual changes. The response from the Darwinists was that your math has to simply be wrong, because it obviously happened, so therefore your math is wrong. Rather than questioning, wow, could it really have happened? We know it happened, and with God off the table, it had to happen in a naturalistic viewpoint. So therefore, any calculations you're doing are off base, because obviously it happened, therefore there had to have been time for it to happen, and therefore your math is flat out wrong. Let's talk about some of the evidences put forward for evolution. Comparative embryology, or embryological recapitulation, or the biogenetic law. Embryology is the branch of biology that deals with the formation and development of the unborn child or animal. The argument is made is that an embryo, as it develops, passes through successive stages of its species development. If you look at this picture, you can see that embryos at various times do tend to look fairly similar. You've got embryos here for a fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. And up at the top, when these embryos are not very far along, if I didn't show the labeling at the bottom on that top row, you might have a tough time figuring out which one was the unborn human as opposed to the unborn turtle. Well, this has been presented in high school textbooks for years and years and years as proof that, look at that, we all look the same in the past, and so therefore we all have to have a common ancestor. So if you were to look at the unborn baby of a human being 3 weeks after conception, you really would be unable to tell the difference between a 3-week-old cow embryo. So the idea is that the development of the unborn is basically the same as for humanity and men and women as it is for all their life forms. The point being made is that we all had to have had the same source, since we all experience the same embryological development. Those subscribing to this theory have in the past alleged that the human embryo actually had gill slits. Remember how the picture looked beneath the chin? It looked like these. They said these were gill slits. And so obviously it's kind of going back through its past evolutionary development. However, these gill slits are not gills or slits. They are pouches that develop into glands, the lower jaw, and, strangely enough to me, the structures of the inner ear. Turns out that the study of embryological development, as it became more detailed than at a merely superficial, looking at pictures level, it became apparent that the theory by and large was incorrect. And it has been long abandoned by Darwinists, which is a very good thing and testimony to the integrity of Darwinists in this viewpoint. But it still shows up in viewpoints and was still put forward as obvious proof to generations of high school students. And it's rather tough once you teach somebody something to go back and try to correct the record. Comparative physiology. Physiology is the branch of biology that deals with the function and vital processes of the parts and organs of living creatures. If you were to compare the structures, organs, and metabolisms of different animals, you would find a great deal of similarity between them. For example, here you've got different hand or paw or leg structures. And even at just a superficial glance, you can tell, I mean, you've got the digits coming out, you've got several bones in the wrist area, and there are some similarities in addition to a lot of differences between them. Comparative physiology. Evolutionists often cite these similarities as proof of evolution, claiming that they were passed on to organisms from a previous common ancestor. It turns out, however, that some of these similarities can be quite difficult for evolutionists to explain because they do not follow a branching process that would have been required for descent with modification, the basic idea of development of new forms if evolution were true. So there is more a mosaic, different kind of patchwork pattern of similarities. There are similarities, which is really important for us because a lot of medicine would not work unless we were similar to animals. You know, the idea of using animal-generated insulin for diabetics, things like that, that can only happen because of comparative similarities between us and the animal world. But comparative physiology is not as supportive of evolutionary claims as they might have you believe, in the same way that comparative embryology was not as much of a trump card, so to speak, as it had been taught to be. Then there are biochemical similarities. We talked about some of these before. This line of evidence proposes that the more similar two life forms are biochemically, protein, line up a protein and count differences in the sequence of a protein, the closer they are to a common ancestor. It's kind of difficult to understand, however, because two different bacteria species have been found to differ more from each other than mammals differ from insects. There's a massive difference between you and me and the honeybee, the praying mantis out in the backyard. Two bacteria that from all appearances look pretty much the same have greater differences in biochemical similarities between themselves, which ought to have been way in the past, closer to that common ancestor than us and the praying mantis. Molecular biologist Michael Denton said it this way: there's little doubt that if this molecular evidence had been available a century ago, that it would have been seized upon with a devastating effect by the opponents of evolution, and that the idea of organic evolution might never have been accepted. But remember, if God is off the table, whatever is left, however improbable, however problematic, has to be the answer, because after all, you're not going to suggest God or something like that, are you? Is a very obvious reply from someone if you're pointing out problems with evolution. Fossil evidence for evolution. The fossil record is often used as evidence that evolution occurred. You can think of Archaeopteryx, the supposed missing link between dinosaurs and birds. In fact, the crucial evidence for evolution really has to come from the paleontologist whose business it is to study the fossil record. So what does the fossil record show? Generally speaking, there does appear to be an orderly progression of animals and plants found within the layers and the record of the rocks. What that means is you don't find, and it has not been found anywhere, a fossilized elephant alongside the remains of a T-Rex dinosaur. You don't find it. T-Rex dinosaurs typically are in different levels from fossils of animals that you find today. You just don't find it mixed up together like that. Sometimes you'll hear the claim be made by certain creationists, incorrectly I might add, and you can check on this, that geological column of different rock strata does not exist. And what's really meant by that, it's true to one extent, in that if the picture that's put in a science textbook, which shows vast layers of rock from different past ages, does not exist in the form of the picture. However, what they're meaning is that it does not occur in any one place, and that this column has been patched together by the geologists from different places scattered around the globe, usually people who believe in evolution. However, there are over 20 places on the earth where you can go. And if you drill a hole down into the ground, you can find rocks from every layer in this standard geological column. You can do it. What's not found is that many of the layers are going to be a lot smaller than they would be in the picture many times in the science textbook. What that would tend to mean is that if rocks were being laid down in some past era, you would think that if this much time had gone by, from what the scientists would tell you, that you ought to have a big layer, but you only have a small layer. Well, fossils don't always, and rock layers don't always get laid down with the same speed or the same application everywhere. And so drilling down in this one spot, you would find over these all these different rock layers. Some of them are big and thick, and some of them are not nearly as thick based on conditions at the time when these rock layers were laid down. So where did all of these rock layers come from? Well, the only real options, if you think of another option, let me know, but the only real options are that they were laid down in the past through normal events laid down over time, or they were laid down during the flood described in the Bible, or something else that I haven't thought about. We will talk about that when we talk about a class on the flood. We're also going to talk more about fossils and gaps next week. This is going to be a rather quick class compared to many of the other ones, but go and look for some of the information that we've talked about. Read about comparative embryology, read about comparative physiology, read about biochemical similarities, and see what you find.